Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the weekly live stream for the Rescue Orbis channel. And as always, I'm your host, Lucius Aurelian. And by popular request, we are taking a look at the films of Stanley Kubrick. Quite an intriguing director. We're going to look at the initial life of Stanley Kubrick, and then we're going to analyze some of the films and what exactly was he saying, or what wasn't he saying in his films. A very intriguing auteur from the 20th century, and someone whose reputation shall endure for all time. But what was his beginning? What was his origin? What were the inspirations for his films? And why do they resonate with us even to this day? For the fact that Stanley Kubrick never released a film in the 21st century. And there's a very definitive reason for that, and the fact that he didn't quite reach the 21st century. But quite an interesting individual with a very intriguing legacy that we're going to look at in detail. And I'd like to extend a greeting to all viewers, all Prime Explorers, and all others joining us. Thank you for being here. Hope that this exploration is going to answer a lot of questions that you have about Stanley Kubrick and also bring to light a lot of other questions. Now, in full disclosure, analyzing a single film of Stanley Kubrick, we could really spend a week doing it. There is so much detail, there's so much imagery, and there's so much allusion and alliteration in all of his films. So I'm not going to try to tackle everything. There's going to be a lot that I'm not going to be able to cover. And like I said, even if we were here all night long, it just simply wouldn't be possible. And that's a compliment to what went into these films. There's a lot of interesting details, though, about these films that we are going to cover, and there's a lot of old world connections. So strap in and let's begin. But before we go into Stanley Kubrick, I just simply wanted to call to mind this individual, Coco Chanel. Who the heck is Coco Chanel, and why are you bringing her up on a Stanley Kubrick live stream exploration? Well, Coco Chanel was a French fashion designer and businesswoman, but she came from very humble beginnings. She wasn't from some noble family or from some very well-to-do, wealthy family, and yet somehow from very, very humble beginnings, her mom did laundry, her father was a street vendor going from town to town selling clothes and undergarments. She was rubbing elbows with people like Winston Churchill in no time. I'm simply calling her to attention because she's one of those very interesting historical figures. And if you have the time, take a look at her biography. It's quite intriguing. We're not going to dive into it in this exploration, but Coco will be coming up in some future explorations. So if you're so inclined to learn a little bit about her, please do. But if not, quite all right. So without further deliberation, let's jump into the life and times of our main topic, Stanley Kubrick. And who officially was Stanley Kubrick, and what was his beginnings? Well, of course, as always, it starts with a lovely old world building. And Stanley Kubrick, born July 26, 1928, died March 7th, 1999. Born in the great city of New York, Manhattan to be specific. And this location that you're looking at initially, the area of his birth, had quite an intriguing name to it, because of the fact that we have these old structures in New York. Space Fraggle, Lord Krug, I wouldn't miss this for a HAL 9000. Yeah, that's right, if only you had your own, right? I don't know what I would do with my own, but, you never know. But one of these interesting hospitals where they tell us that about 60% of the births in Manhattan, Manhattan, New York City, it's kind of a large place, occurred. And quite an interesting structure, stated to have been built right after the turn of the 20th century, 1902. And of course, they called it one of these lying-in hospitals because that's what they considered birthing back then. How very interesting. Now, official history tells us that by the 1930s, shortly after Stanley Kubrick was born here, that they had moved it to other facilities. Of course they did. And you can see it's quite a lovely and intricate old-world building. I mean, why don't we build hospitals or birthing or prenatal units or whatever we're calling them now in some kind of fashion like this? Well, I suppose we have our reasons. So what's really the background of Stanley Kubrick? And here we have his senior portrait, and he certainly looks a lot cooler and more applied than I did in my senior portrait. I mean, I looked like a total dork when I was a senior. But an individual who came from a varied background, a Jewish Romanian family, and then some other indications of influence, although it should be noted that Stanley was not raised religious. And there's also a very curious lack of any references to any sort of groups or institutions that he officially belonged to. Now, yes, the guy who would rise to become what was considered one of the greatest, if not the greatest directors of the 20th century, was not from the old Hollywood royalty. Very, very intriguing. And in fact, he was considered unapplied in school. He considered school a waste of time. What a bizarre coincidence, quite similar to some of the most intelligent people that I know and have known in my life. And I'll admit that I share some feelings with what Stanley Kubrick stated he thought of school. It stifled creativity. It was simply about repetition and recitation. And yes, that seems to be a lot of what school is. Now, you might say that's a little bit of a dim view of school, and maybe so. But as you're well aware, I had quite extensive experience with the university system, and I was quite struck by how much recitation and repetition there was there. He was just talking about high school and earlier, or secondary school, as you call it in other locations. And so he didn't really apply himself in school. And as a result, he found himself as a photographer for Look, a magazine I'm sure you've never heard of that was quite active in the 1940s. You know, this particular image of him, he's bearing a striking resemblance to Dimitri back when I still watched Cobra Kai, you know, around season 3. Then I stopped watching it. I'm not sure why. I guess I just ran out of time. But here you can see an individual who was really self-taught. And that's the most intriguing detail about Stanley Kubrick's biography, is that he was self-taught. Self-taught as a photographer, self-taught as a person who eventually got into movies. Because in his words, he saw the movies of the time, 1940s, early 1950s, and he believed that he could make better films. And he would set out to do just that. Also, another little note about Stanley as he went on with his life is that he was an avid chess player, a chess grandmaster, in fact. And it was by playing the game of chess, which he was known to play throughout New York City at various locations, that he actually met one of his initial collaborative partners and formed a partnership with him. And that's how he got into more mainstream filming. Here's one of his images of Chicago from the late 1940s, and I'm struck by how much of the old world detail that you can see in Chicago in this image. But that's some of his artwork, and you can see how it would eventually parlay into his films. And here a little image of him doing what he really preferred to do and play chess. And it's also stated that he used the game of chess and the strategies behind it to come up with a lot of strategies in his filmmaking style. Now, really consider this. This is a guy who was not ever officially trained in filmmaking. He never went to a single skill or a single school for filmmaking. He taught himself. He learned from others, he refined techniques, and then through his own creative inspiration, he came up with his own filmmaking techniques. The other thing about him was that he was known for having total creative control over his projects. Now, whatever your knowledge is on filmmaking, there are a lot of different hands in the pot. There are a lot of different people that are involved within it. You have to have a cinematographer who actually makes your director's vision come true. You have to have a good editor. You have to have a good producer and a good writer. Those are some of the essential roles, but not all of them. But you see that many films where you have the director, the writer, and the producer that are the same person, those are films that sometimes tend to be beset by, how shall we say, struggles. And yet most of Stanley Kubrick's projects, he was all three. And he had total creative control over his filmmaking. Now, it's also an item of controversy with him because some actors, such as Tom Cruise, when he was filming Eyes Wide Shut, had to do over 90 takes with just him going through a door because Stanley Kubrick was particular in terms of actually getting the real performance. And this guy really paid attention to detail within his films, as we're about to find out. And so because of this and because of his early partnerships, he suddenly became that person who was widely known to make wonderful films. And suddenly some independent films, he was picked to film his first major project that had Hollywood backing, and that was in 1957, the World War I film Paths of Glory. Now, Paths of Glory is based on a 1935 novel by Humphrey Cobb. And let me make sure I get this up here. And what's interesting about this particular period that we're going to be talking about with Stanley Kubrick's initial filmmaking career, I'm not going to cover all his films. I decided just to cover the first part of his filmmaking career. And you're probably going to say, oh, I'm disappointed. Well, why are you doing this? Because like I said, just covering a single film of Stanley Kubrick, there's so much detail and there's so much intricacy in it. I wouldn't be doing it justice if I tried to cover all of his films. So I picked some of the key films that we're really going to focus on. And these are also the films that really plug back into some of the things that he may have been saying about the old world and the connection of the old world. Now, like I said, we don't have any official accounts that state what his quote unquote group affiliations were. And they're probably really not that important. His biography says that he made his own relationships, and he seemed to be someone who would make and break relationships, as we'll find out. Because Paths of Glory, he would forge a working relationship with Kirk Douglas. And oddly enough, if you look at who really produced and provided a lot of the details for Paths of Glory, you'll find that it was considered a Kirk Douglas vehicle, as was a subsequent film that Stanley Kubrick would direct called Spartacus. But what is so interesting about Paths of Glory and when it came out? Well, we have to be aware of the historical context of where we are. By the way, a little note about Stanley Kubrick's father, when you look up what exactly his father did. And it's very interesting because his father was stated to be a homeopathic doctor who graduated from the New York Homeopathic Medical College in 1927. His father of Polish Jewish and Romanian Jewish origin. So Polish, Romanian Jewish. Now, funny thing is, if you look up what a homeopathic doctor is, you'll see that terrifying word, pseudoscience. Yes, homeopathic doctors are labeled as pseudoscience now. So that's a very interesting beginning for him, given who his father was, being a doctor, but a homeopathic doctor. Good luck finding a homeopathic doctor today. You can, but remember, they'll be labeled pseudoscience. And by the way, that brings up our word for the day, pseudo-debunking. Because can anybody who's not an official historian or a scientist actually debunk anything? No, then they are doing pseudo-debunking. Just my little joke for the day. Now, the film period that we're looking at with Stanley Kubrick in these initial films, starting with Paths of Glory in 1957, it's an era of transition, the 1950s to the early 1970s. And we go through that wonderful period of urban renewal, and we also go through Great Society, the post-war period. There was also this little conflict going on called Vietnam, and there were a series of other conflicts going on all over the place. There was the great Sino-Soviet split in the late 1960s that history overlooks. And when we start here in the 1950s, this is when that Soviet juggernaut was really threatening Europe, at least according to mainstream history. So this is the context that we're in. This is where Paths of Glory, a film about World War I released in 1957, would really bring everything into mind. Space Fraggle here, talking about Full Metal Jacket. And you know what's interesting there, Space Fraggle, is that while Stanley Kubrick only did one movie set in space, he did multiple films, starting with Paths of Glory, that were war films. So it seemed he had a lot to say through the whole conflict mentality. And so let us take a look at some of the images from Paths of Glory. Now, I don't know if you've seen Paths of Glory. It is a 1950s film. Uh-oh. Having some technical issues. Okay, I think we're working past it there. Stop screen, share screen. Let's make sure this works. And there we go, it's working. And Paths of Glory, 1957, based on an earlier novel. And let me make sure I full screen this. There we go. Based on the earlier novel from 1935, novel of the same name by Humphrey Cobb. Now, interesting thing about Humphrey Cobb, while the novel highlights a real historical event in which 4 French corporals in World War I were killed at a firing squad because they were deemed cowardly, Humphrey Cobb was actually an Italian-born Canadian-American screenwriter and novelist, but he did serve in World War I. So just a couple details to really hammer through about that, because I think that's important as well. Anyway, Paths of Glory. So keep in mind, 1957, and what you'll find, a lot of people, this was their first exposure to Stanley Kubrick, this film. And this was really his first mainstream Hollywood film that he had total creative control over. Quite interesting. A new, young, up-and-coming director who was given total creative control. Stars Kirk Douglas, so it's considered a Kirk Douglas vehicle. And the film begins, here's the old hardcover of the novel by Humphrey Cobb, just for showing it. And what's the real context of the film? The killing fields of World War I, trench warfare, and it's set within the French army. Now, the French army receives a lot of bad press from other Western armies. But during this particular time in the 1950s, you had this concept of the new NATO armies being stood up. And for anyone, a filmmaker or really anybody, to call into question the capability of any of the Western armies or their bravery. It was very controversial. This was a very controversial film because what this film showed was the reality of life in trench warfare. And even more controversially to this day, it shows the reality of the nuances of military leadership, even in the Western armies that are considered the great liberal democracies that brought about victory in both World War I and World War II. So as a result, they didn't actually film Paths of Glory in France. He filmed it in Bavaria, in Germany, in the mid-1950s. Keep in mind, this was right as Western Germany was being reconditioned, and the Bundeswehr, the German armed forces, had just been stood up 2 years before this in 1955. So all this was going on at the same time. Now, remember, this was about 6-7 years after NATO was formed in 1949. But remember, it took a while before they reorganized both the separate German nations, East and West Germany, respectively. And the plot of this film, it is based on the book and based on a historical event in 1915 in France, where French political pressure was they needed to drive the Germans off their land, and therefore they were conducting attacks. Now, you might have heard of some of these mutinies, some of these revolts that occurred because these attacks across no man's land in trench warfare were, quite frankly, futile. And this film is an honest depiction of that. And here you can see some of the techniques that Stanley Kubrick actually mastered in this film. And even though this is in black and white, I strongly encourage you to go back and watch this entire film, because you'll see that there's a particular way that this film is made that just completely transcends what you'd expect to see with blocking, camera movement. A lot of it was revolutionary. Nobody had ever seen anything like it. And what you'll see from people when they first saw this movie in firsthand accounts was they wanted to find out who the director was. But again, this is a very controversial movie. And in fact, the outcome of this movie was that it was banned in many of the Western nations. I don't think they could even show it in France until the 1970s. And you may have heard in the past, I was even aware of a U.S. Army officer who received a general officer memorandum of reprimand for showing this film to his students in the 2000s, because apparently it was still on a guidance that they weren't supposed to show this film. Quite intriguing. And I think the reason is because it shows, well, the interpretation of how officers are in the military. And so here you've got Kirk Douglas. And what's intriguing is since it was filmed in Bavaria, you have a lot of these incredible old world buildings. And you see what's really going on, what's displayed in terms of the different hierarchies within the military, how things go from the generals down to the mid-grade officers and then all the way down to the soldiers, and what's really happening and whose lives are worth what and whose lives are worth nothing. Now, if you're not familiar with the plot, just to quickly overview it to you, this French unit is sent on a helpless attack, and because of it, they have no hope of succeeding. And in fact, the film revolves around this particular character, General Moreau here, played by George Macready. George Macready is actually an American actor from Brown University, but he plays the part perfectly. And really, he operates as the main antagonist through the film. But as you find out at the end, he is not the greatest antagonist in the film. And he operates as the military-minded general, the martinet. And the other intriguing thing about the film is that as you go through it, the soldiers that are court-martialed for cowardice, well, one of them didn't even show cowardice. In fact, he had been commended for bravery numerous times. But because this attack didn't succeed, they decided that they were going to shoot 3 of the soldiers for cowardice, whether they actually had anything to do with it or not. And Kirk Douglas, who's the regimental commander of this unit that is assigned to carry out this hopeless attack, he tries to defend them. But the trial's a farce, and ultimately they're condemned to death, and the film ends with them being executed. No, nobody saves them. This is a very realistic film. And so now you can see why this was such a controversial film at the time. But looking at any still from the film, you can see the attention to detail that Stanley Kubrick would put into directing his films. And, of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the incredible old world building that this trial occurred in. Now, you can look up the specific filming locations, and keep in mind this trial was really more of a drumhead, the military trial, to where they could rapidly mete out punishment. And historically, that's exactly what happened with these 4 French corporals that were promptly executed because of a failed attack. And of course, you can study all you want to about trench warfare, and you only had 2 forms of maneuver, frontal attack and infiltration. And Kirk Douglas, his character, Colonel Dax, and you really don't have his first name mentioned at all in the film, which is quite intriguing. And He operates as the protagonist. He's the idealistic military officer who genuinely cares about his soldiers' lives. And he's really the only leader in this entire film who cares about his soldiers' lives. He tries to defend the 3 soldiers selected to be executed, but it's all for naught because the trial already has a predetermined conclusion. Sound kind of familiar? And of course, General Moreau, played by George McReady, his immediate superior, the division commander. And I'll talk about how this whole situation came to be, but you see that this particular character appears to be a military professional in his first scene. But as the film progresses, you just see all of the deprivations that he commits. He doesn't really care about his soldiers. He doesn't really care about anybody aside from his own career. Although he gives the facade of actually caring about his unit. But like I said, he is not the true antagonist in the film. He is the secondary antagonist. But there is a primary antagonist in the film that really drives it. And that's this particular character, General Brulard, the Corps commander. It's at his orders that the entire plot of the film is kicked off, where he says that the French government needs to make some advances against the German advance in France and seize back some territory. Now, if you're not familiar with the conduct of World War I, this being based on the historical events in 1915, the Imperial German Army had seized quite a bit of French territory, and they were threatening Paris. And so there was a lot of pressure coming down from the French government to their military commanders to take back that territory. But remember the nuances of trench warfare. And the plot begins when General Brulard here, the Corps commander, tasks General Muru, the division commander, to carry out an attack to seize this key German position called the Ant Hill. Now, there's another interesting detail about this film. You do not see a single German soldier in this film. You only see the French soldiers. And yet, this is one of the most devastating and terrifying depictions of World War I. Now, you've probably seen 1917, the more recent World War I film, and it is a very good film. But it doesn't exactly match the hopelessness, the nihilism, and the terror that's really conveyed within this particular film. And that was the other reason this film was very, very controversial, because of the fact that it showed true military leadership at that time. Oh yeah, mustard gas and all the other nuances of the war. And I mean, this is the early war. This is even before they were using chemical weapons, at least from what we understand it. So, anyway. Oh yeah, Lolita. If only I could talk about that film in more detail. It's another one of his interesting films. But getting back on topic. So Kirk Douglas says that there's no way that his regiment can actually conduct this attack. And even General Muru, when he's tasked by General Brulard to conduct the attack, he tells him, my division's been cut to pieces. We're at about half strength. He says he's got 8,000 lives. And at that time, the table of organization for a French division was 16,000. So they're at 50% strength. And he says to General Brulard, there's no way we can do this. I mean, I can't even defend the anthill, let alone seize it. And then, of course, he tasks Kirk Douglas, Colonel Dax, and his regiment, the 701st, to carry out the attack, openly telling him that, yes, you're probably going to take 60-70% casualties, but it'll be a grand success. And by the way, when you see the scene that occurs where General Brulard tasks General Muru with seizing the position, and General Muru says, I can't do it, General Brulard wonderfully manipulates him by telling him, well, we'll give you a promotion. You'll get that star. Here you can see the execution scene. And this was probably the most terrifying scene in the film, because you can see that one of the individuals selected for execution, and by the way, they were selected for execution at random and had nothing to do with their performance in the battle. One of the individuals wasn't even conscious, and the general said, well, just simply pinch him awake. Anyway, after the 3 soldiers are executed from the 701st, General Muru very coldly says, Colonel Dax, your men died very well. And Colonel Dax, during the attack, and they do show every detail of the attack and what a miserable failure it is, because as soon as they go out of the trenches, they're hit by German artillery. You get the impression they're even hit by some of their own artillery. Historically, the French unit was hit by their own artillery. And before they even get close to the anthill, they're already being attrited and their attack has been stopped. And maybe the only effects you have from the Germans are the machine gun fire, and that's about it. Like I said, you don't see a single German soldier. And there's an entire company, B Company, from the 701st that refuses to attack. And that's what sets the plot in motion. And here you've got a still of Stanley Kubrick and the filming that he did in Germany, and lovely old world building back there, and how they set up for a lot of these shots. Now here's George McReady as General Muru, often seen by everybody as the main antagonist of the film, but actually he's the secondary antagonist, because he represents the martinet, the military man that's committed to the code, and all the dialogue and the lines that he says is that he's committed to that. And yet in the film, when he's trying to get B Company from the 701st to attack because they won't leave their trenches, he gives a very controversial order to his own artillery commander to fire on their own soldiers. The artillery commander refuses the order, saying that unless I have a written order, I'm not going to do that, because the artillery commander, who's a very smart individual and clearly has a lot of bravery to refuse an order from a general, says that, what happens if you die and you didn't give me a written order? Where would I be? So he refuses to fire artillery on his own men. And you see the true nature of General Miru, because he's willing to do anything to get this attack to succeed. Even though in the opening dialogue, when he's briefed and he briefs about his capabilities, he says, there's no way an attack can carry the anthill. My division's been cut to pieces. And you expect me to do it? I couldn't even defend it, let alone seize it. He's well aware of the situation. But then, of course, the Corps commander, General Bullard, says, well, we'll give you a promotion. Yeah, I don't want the promotion to affect your decision. Well, of course we can do it, he says. And that's really how the film plays out. And you start to see the darker side of General Miru, where he orders artillery on his own soldiers. He wants to actually decimate. I shouldn't say that. He actually wants to shoot over 100 soldiers from the regiment. And Kirk Douglas actually somewhat comically and very disturbingly suggests, well, why not just shoot the whole regiment? I'm quite serious. And General Bullard says, we don't want to slaughter the French army. No, that's for the Germans to do, right? And it's quite a lively discussion that they have. And like I said, I suggest you watch the entire film and watch the interplay of it from start to finish, because really it's a masterpiece when it conveys the archetypes, if you will, of the military and how things play out in the military. Now, while this was controversial because it's about the French army, really this could be about any army on any side during any conflict. In fact, the three archetypes that you have of the officers, the idealist, which is Kirk Douglas, and then you've got the Martinet, which is General Miru, and then you have the career-minded opportunist, which is General Bullard. And General Bullard, as we find out at the end of the film, the individual on the right, played by Adolphe Menjou, who, interestingly enough, was also a supporter of the House Un-American Committee in Hollywood in the 1950s, according to the official history. Quite an intriguing background back then, because remember, that was also going on in light of all the rest of this. He gives a very brilliant performance, though, as the career-minded opportunist, the guy who's willing to manipulate any series of affairs to get what he wants. He manipulates this attack out of General Miru. General Miru agrees to the attack, even despite correctly saying that his division's in no condition to conduct it. And then General Miru pressures Colonel Dax, the idealist, to conduct the attack. And then he even threatens to relieve Colonel Dax. And Colonel Dax, who General Bullard identifies as an idealist and calls him out for it, says, well, why not take me? Don't kill anybody from the regiment, kill me. I'm the commander, I'm the man most responsible. And General Bullard says, it's not a question of officers. Ah, yes. And so you can see why, with all of this dialogue and all these details shown in this movie, why this was such a controversial movie. Now, in the end, Kirk Douglas's character, Colonel Dax, documents the fact that General Miru ordered artillery on his own positions, and therefore General Bullard says there's going to be an inquiry. And General Miru leaves very grumpy and says, I'm the only innocent man, and I'm going to be the victim. Ah, yes, the guy who wanted to shoot 100 of his own soldiers earlier, even though at the very beginning of the movie, he says that he values the life of every soldier. Yeah, I guess he values the life of every soldier so long as his career is safeguarded, right? And that's how the film plays out. And it's a very somber affair. By the way, if anybody recognizes the future Dr. Eldon Tyrell from Blade Runner, he is actually in this film, and he portrays the soldier who's been decorated for bravery in previous engagements. There's also another line that I love from this film where General Miru says, we're not talking about yesterday, we're talking about today. So it doesn't matter how many positions they had seized, it doesn't matter how many battles they won or how many acts of heroism, it doesn't matter what you did in the past. All that matters is today. And we're, of course, going to judge you for what you did today, even though there was no hope for success today. And that's actually based on the real historical story. Now, you can make the argument, does this happen in the United States military? Well, no, not officially, because, the United States military and the Uniform Code of Military Justice is always correct. And they do a very good job of safeguarding any sort of controversial issues like this. So the reality is there are no Dreyfus affairs in the United States Army, and there was never a situation where the United States Army would put their soldiers in this position. Not officially, anyway. But like I said, make of it what you will. And remember, there was a U.S. Army officer who did receive a general officer memorandum of reprimand for showing this film, only about, I think it was 15, 16 years ago. Now, the film ends with the regiment, after they watch their comrades be executed for not conducting the attack, with the only German that we see in the film. This lady who's a captive German girl, and she sings a German song, a somber song, what was it? I think it was The Last Hauser. And of course, she's singing it in German, and yet the French soldiers listen to it, and they have a brief moment of comfort. And that's how the film ends. And Colonel Dax, Kirk Douglas, is coming to tell them, okay, well, we're going to go back to the trenches. He actually gives them a minute with her. Interestingly enough, this also would become Stanley Kubrick's third wife, and the lady he remained married to until he died. So I guess third time was a charm. But anyway, that's the overall film, Paths of Glory. Yeah, there you go. They always make the German girls sing, don't they? And that's how the film ends, and that's really the power behind it. Yeah, that's it, Michael. That's it, Michael. Yeah, you're right. It was The Faithful Hauser. You're correct. And it's a very beautiful song, and even if you listen to it in German and how it motivates everybody. So anyway, that's the film that everybody saw that got Stanley Kubrick on the map, Paths of Glory. Now, in 1960, there was Spartacus. Now, I'm not going to talk in as much detail about Spartacus. We've talked about it before a few times. But it was a Kirk Douglas project, and the original director wasn't getting the job done. And so Kirk Douglas called Stanley Kubrick. Now, there was a lot of controversy and friction between Kirk Douglas and Stanley Kubrick and Spartacus. Because one thing about Stanley Kubrick, he was big about having total creative control on his films. And Kirk Douglas was very disgruntled about the fact that Stanley Kubrick had actually cut a lot of the characters' dialogue in Spartacus, even though Spartacus is considered one of the most successful and incredible epic movies. And Stanley Kubrick, once again, was the youngest director that pulled it off. But just recall that there was a lot of friction between Kirk Douglas and Stanley Kubrick. In fact, their professional working relationship ended over this film. There's also a lot of subtext within the film about it being an analogy for what was going on with the House Un-American Committee, everything else that had happened in Hollywood in the 1950s. Isn't it kind of funny how Hollywood's like on a giant teeter-totter? One side, they're on one side of the political spectrum one decade, then a couple years later, they're on the completely opposite side of the political spectrum. But I guess you could say that for any major institution. It's just interesting to think that this was the end of Kirk Douglas and Stanley Kubrick's working relationship. And this was a very successful, epic film. And everyone will remember Kirk Douglas's role in this film. Everybody can quote this film. And this film, I would even say it's a far better film. And I know I'm putting my neck on the chopping block here, but in my opinion, it's a better film than the original Gladiator. And I'm a great fan of the original Gladiator. But, just my opinion, make of it what you will. It also features Laurence Olivier. And Laurence Olivier playing Crassus wonderfully. It's a pity we didn't get to see more roles like this from Laurence Olivier. He has a very strong presence. There's also this little location shot that they did. Does anybody know, this is Crassus's villa in the film, where this was shot? Let's see if anybody knows, because we have featured this before. This lovely location. And I'll give you a hint, I did an exploration on it too. Hey, Sooner West, good to see you. Oh, someone's all over it. Jedi Red Eye, yes. Hearst Castle. Tabor, yes. Hearst Castle. That is Neptune Pool. So look, Stanley Kubrick, who had a pilot's license but did not like to fly, would not fly, was wonderful with location scouting. And if you want to show a Roman villa, you don't go to Italy. You go to California off the Pacific Coast Highway, and there you find yourself the Pool of Neptune. And you got yourself the perfect location for Spartacus. I just always found that rather comical. Another one of those little inconsistencies that we have. Or maybe it's a consistency, make of it what you will. So now we start to go to things getting very interesting because Stanley Kubrick is getting a lot of momentum here. He's had Spartacus under his belt. He had Paths of Glory. And now we get Dr. Strangelove. And Dr. Strangelove, one of those films that just resonates through time. Officially, this film is a satire. It's also considered, as they called it at the time, a black comedy. Now, interesting point though, and the full title is Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. Little detail about Stanley Kubrick. He did a lot of studying in preparing for this film. And what's really interesting about it was that officially, he said that he was concerned about a nuclear attack. And something to know about Stanley Kubrick, he relocated from the United States in the early 1960s to the United Kingdom, Great Britain. And yet he still had the full support of all the studios. So what you have here is a filmmaker who has total creative control over his projects, and he has virtually unlimited funding. It's quite an amazing combination. And there's something else that what Stanley Kubrick would do before he would make a film is he would do intense study. Because we went over his biographical background. Stanley Kubrick was never a soldier. He was never a politician. I mean, he was a photojournalist to an extent. But yet he was always able to convey these films as though he had intricate technical detail. And how was he able to do that? Because he took the time to study and consult with the experts. Now you can find a later example of this when he made Full Metal Jacket, bringing in R. Lee Ermey, the drill sergeant, or Gunnery Sergeant Hartman, as he's more popularly or commonly known as. And here's the thing. R. Lee Ermey was just supposed to be a technical advisor in the film. But he decided to actually give him the role of the drill sergeant, Gunnery Sergeant Hartman, in the film. Now, yes, that was unfortunate for the actor Tim Colsuri, trying to remember how you pronounce his name, but he was given the role of the door gunner. Anyway, back to Dr. Strangelove. So after doing all this technical study, here's the war room. What a set. I mean, can you imagine seeing a set like this in film? And remember, there was no computer-generated effects at this time. Everything was done practically. The incredible war room. But remember, this film was a satire. Now, why was it a satire? You might have heard of the earlier film, Failsafe, which conveyed the terror and the threat of nuclear war. And as everybody understood it in the 1960s, this was the great threat facing everyone. Nuclear annihilation. But here was the result of Stanley Kubrick's studies on nuclear annihilation. It was all absurd. That's what he said. The whole concept of nuclear annihilation is absurd. Yes. Colonel Guamo, the airborne commander who comes in and seizes the airbase at the end of the film. And that's really what this film really is. It's absurdity in nuclear war. Mutually assured destruction. The whole thing is absurd. And so he makes it into a comedy film. And here's Stanley Kubrick playing chess with George C. Scott. And you might recall George C. Scott is very famous for portraying General George S. Patton. In fact, you could say in a way that George C. Scott became General Patton. Or maybe you could say that General Patton is remembered as George C. Scott. And if you want to trick your mind out, here's something to do. Listen to the speech that George C. Scott gives as General Patton in the film Patton, and then actually listen to Patton's real speech that's given by Patton. Compare and contrast the voices and mannerisms, and just tell me what you think. It's quite intriguing. But the whole premise of this film is that there is a whacked out U.S. Air Base commander, General Ripper, who believes that our bodily fluids are being contaminated by communist influences, and on his own initiative, orders and authorizes a nuclear attack against the Soviet Union. And because of the fact that the pilots just simply follow their orders and follow procedures, there is no way to recall this attack. So it's kind of similar in a way to the plot of Failsafe, but it's played for laughs. There's a lot of comedy in it. And great actor Peter Sellers actually plays 3 roles in the film. A Royal Air Force officer, the U.S. President, and of course the eponymous Dr. Strangelove, the German scientist no doubt brought about with Operation Paperclip, who gives the U.S. administration all of his great technological advisory details on how they're going to survive a nuclear war and how they need to have the best mine shafts. And as General Turgidson, George C. Scott's character, says, we cannot afford to have a mine shaft gap. And this movie has been quoted and lampooned in many times. What's really intriguing, though, about Peter Sellers' performance is he manages to convincingly play a guy who's a Midwestern U.S. president, a Royal Air Force officer, and then, of course, a completely whacked out German scientist who has alien hand syndrome, as they called it. There's other names for it, but yeah, that's how the film comes across. And there's another little fun note about this. The B-52 Stratofortress, the United States intercontinental bomber, or at least I should say the long-range heavy bomber available at the time, that is still in service to this day. Its first flight was in 1952. So yeah, do the math on that. That's some serious equipment longevity there. The nation that spends the most money on its military, although people would argue the Soviet Union spent more money during the Cold War, but no one's going to argue that the United States spend the most money on its military equipment to this day. And then, of course, let's not forget Slim Pickens as the commander of the ill-fated B-52 who decides to ride the nuclear warhead down to its target. And, of course, he can only follow his orders. He can't question anything. Although what's interesting is if you look at some of the subsequent nuclear films, nuclear destruction films that were made, let's take two from the 1990s. There was By Dawn's Early Light that had Powers Booth in a similar role as a B-52 commander. And he actually sees the fact that the attack is real, but he's reluctant to carry out his attack. Major Kong here is definitely not reluctant to carry out his attack. Come hell or high water, that bomb is dropping, and he even rides it down himself to make sure it drops. Now, of course, you can also look at Crimson Tide, the submarine movie from the mid-1990s with Denzel Washington's character, Commander Hunter, at odds with Gene Hackman's character, and how he does not want to launch the nuclear arsenal no matter what, even with orders. He's reluctant to do so. And this film is very entertaining for the performance from George C. Scott because Stanley Kubrick was actually able to get George C. Scott to essentially be a comedian and really play the role of General Turgidson with a parody, which George C. Scott was not about doing. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with George C. Scott. He was from Missouri, educated at the University of Missouri, and will always be famous for Patton, reprised the role in the mid-1980s. But the performance he got out of him was because he was able to play him in chess. And that's why I showed the images of him playing George C. Scott in chess. Oh, there's also an early appearance by James Earl Jones, long before he portrayed the voice of Darth Vader and all the other great roles that he had. Sad that he passed away recently. And of course, my favorite role for him was when he played Thulsa Doom in the original Conan the Barbarian. He's part of the B-52 crew. And so it's really intriguing because you see this complex interweaving of professionalism from characters such as James Earl Jones with his complete insanity from characters like General Turgidson. And yet there's something that almost feels strangely real about it. Now, what was Stanley Kubrick really saying? Was he saying that nuclear war, the concept, was absurd? Or was he saying that it was all just a big laugh because it wasn't even possible in some way, shape, or form? You have to decide what to really make of this film, but if you go back and you watch it and you look at the way that it's staged, the blocking, in other words, the position of the camera, the actors, the way that this conversation between the US president and the Soviet premier plays out. I mean, at one point it seems like it's deadly serious, and then a second later it is high comedy. It's really incredible how this film works in so many different ways. It really shouldn't. It should be a total farce. But the way it's filmed and the way that in certain places it's played serious, and it's something you're never going to see in films again, I promise you. I mean, now it's just, everything is not to be taken seriously. We've got the way that our films are made with computer-generated images. You can't do practical effects so much anymore. And you won't get performances like this. Because it's not just the way that they do the voices with the characters, it's also the facial expressions. I mean, notice that facial acting seems to have, let's just say it's neglected a little bit. Again, that's my opinion. Maybe you think it's wonderful, and, people beyond Anna Taylor-Joy can do it very well. I don't know. That's just my opinion. Still interesting to me that the B-52 is still in service all these years later. And the performance by George C. Scott, a lot of people say it landed him the role of Patton, which is what he's most remembered for. And then, of course, who can forget the hilarious final scene where Dr. Strangelove is briefing the entire war room. There's no fighting in here. This is the war room, about his crazed plans for how they're going to survive a nuclear catastrophe. It's not to be taken seriously. It is a big laugh. Now, one final detail that I'll leave you with is the fact that in this film, it was supposed to end with a gigantic pie fight. We understand that the film ends with the end of the world, but what's Stanley Kubrick really saying? Is he saying that nuclear war is inevitable, or is he saying that it's one big joke? Now, oddly enough, Kubrick said he was going to move away from the United States because he was concerned about nuclear attack, so he moves to the United Kingdom, an area that's stated to be even more vulnerable to nuclear attack because you don't have as much terrain there all the targets are a lot closer together. The cities are a lot closer together, and it's covered with NATO air bases. So it'd be a very high payoff target. And so that's the interesting thing. So obviously in his actions, Kubrick was not really concerned about a nuclear exchange, but he had given statements that he was. So as I'm famous for saying, make of it what you will. But there's what the guy said and there's what he did, as there is for all of this, myself included. So let's go to the Piece o' Resistance, 2001, A Space Odyssey. Yeah, I'm having a little bit of fun with this one. And here's the really interesting thing about 2001. A lot of people aren't aware that even though this film was released in 1968, before I get the images up, I'll ask you a question. When was this film actually filmed? When did they put this incredible film together? And why is it remembered as an incredible film? Why is it so influential? And how did Stanley Kubrick actually get the inspiration for this film, or really all his films? Because if you haven't noticed, he has a propensity for adapting novels. So no, he didn't remake films that were already made. He found novels and translated them into films. Not exactly an easy thing to do. 1967, not bad guesses, not bad guesses. Yeah. Would you be surprised to know it was actually earlier? He started planning the film in 65 and filmed most of the scenes in space with Keir Dullea and Gary Lockwood on the Discovery in 1966. And then spent a lot of time in post-production and editing. Yeah, there you go. The monolith is the phone. That's a good one, Squiggles. I hadn't really thought of that before. So, anyway, pictured here is Arthur C. Clarke, the science fiction author extraordinaire and space travel enthusiast. Although, to my knowledge, Arthur C. Clarke never actually went to space. But, he's one of those great visionaries. And it was actually a short story, The Sentinel, and that all that story was just the discovery of the monolith on the moon. And that short story alone inspired this incredible collaboration between Stanley Kubrick and Arthur C. Clarke to write the plot for 2001: A Space Odyssey. Although it gets even more interesting because you can read 2001: A Space Odyssey by Arthur C. Clarke and then watch the film by Stanley Kubrick, and there are a lot of significant differences. And so that's just very, very intriguing. One of the big differences that a lot of people realize is that in Arthur C. Clarke's novel, the big monolith, TMA2 as they call it, the 2-kilometer long one or whatever it was, is located at Saturn. And in Stanley Kubrick's film, 2001, it's by Jupiter. And the whole reason for that was because the special effects limitations, they could only show Jupiter. Now, let's go through this film and unpack it in a little bit of detail. It begins with the dawn of man, as they say. But the most interesting detail about 2001 is that it is a very open film. There is no dialogue in the entire opening scene, and there is no dialogue in the closing scene. Well, of course, there's no dialogue in the opening scene. They're apes, right? Now, originally, they intended these to be Neanderthals, but they went to apes for, the censor reasons and, not trying to kick up any more controversy, apparently. But it's intriguing because what you see is the opening landscapes. And a lot of people are derogatory towards 2001 because, well, it's a very slow film. It's a very artistic film. But all the people who watched it in the 1960s, because of the fact that it was such an open film, a lot was left to interpretation. It does not insult the audience. You'd have responses from people ranging from the most religious people you can imagine to atheists. And they all appreciated the film. They all saw a different message in the film. And let's start with one of these initial messages. You would think that this film is actually being a proponent of the evolution theory, fact, as Carl Sagan calls it. Carl Sagan very clearly says it's a fact that really happened in Cosmos, but that's just what he said. I'm not saying that. But there's also the detail that this doesn't support evolution. And I'll get to it in a moment. So the film starts with this very unfortunate tribe of hominids, and they're living in a very desolate land, and they're starving. They can barely sustain themselves. They're on the verge of being destroyed. They're chased off from a water hole by a rival tribe, and it looks like they're going to die. But then they're also being pursued by this terrifying leopard that just feeds on them very easily. So things are looking really, really bad. But suddenly you see them encounter this very strange and obvious artificial object, Unless, of course, I found it in some random location, and someone might try to tell you that's a natural formation made by erosion. Okay, sarcasm level maxed out. I know. But in the film, it's very clearly an artificial object. And these hominids, these apes, these early men, whatever you want to think of them as, they interface with it. And somehow it gives them the inspiration, the idea. It develops their minds to where these hominids, and you also have this very incredible shot. And you may recall you see this alignment. Alignments are key in this film because this is an artistic film of the monolith, the sun, and the moon. And you may recall there's a similar alignment that's also shown in John Carpenter's film, Prince of Darkness. No coincidence. No coincidence. And if you recall some of the explorations that we did of Dubuque and Dyersville in Iowa, you'll know what that coincidence is. But moving on, suddenly these hominids have the idea to use tools, to use bones as clubs, and therefore they're able to hunt the nearby animals using the bones as clubs, killing them and ending their starvation. They're also able to use the bones to kill the leopard that's hunting them. Granted, the film doesn't show it, it implies it, but then they're able to drive off the rival tribe at the watering hole. And then, of course, the hominid, monkey, early man, whatever, throws the bone up in the air and it becomes a spaceship. Now, how does this run against the evolution theory? I'll explain. There was no evolution here. There was an influence that came from some kind of higher power. Now, atheists would say that higher power, the monolith, was an alien intelligence. Religious people would say that monolith was the divine force of God or Allah or whatever name that we have for him, depending what our belief system is. So you can suddenly see how the brilliance of this film, and it's open to interpretation. It really doesn't support the evolution theory. There was no evolution. These monkeys, these hominids were going to die out. They didn't evolve. They were given the ability to succeed. And yet that is a question that we have. Now, again, remember, I'm just interpreting the film here. I'm not giving you my opinion. But the real question that we have is, why is it that human beings were the only ones that developed the use of tools? Why did no other animal go to this extreme with it? Now, there are arguments and observations. There are certain other animals, little parrots will use their feet to scratch themselves and so on and so forth. But you don't see them using tools, and you certainly don't see them developing high technology, building, say, B-52 bombers and everything else that goes along with it, because we do know we can build airplanes, and we do know that they can fly. We could also build airships, cars, and everything else. But it all started with a bone. And then in the film, the bone transitions into, well, it's ambiguous in the film. It's supposed to be just a space device. But if you look a little bit more closely, it was supposed to be a early Star Wars platform, if you will. And that's what it was supposed to represent in the film, the bone that transitions to it. Now, in the novel, it makes it very clear. It's a Star Wars platform. It's got intercontinental ballistic missiles within it. But the film, it's ambiguous because Stanley had just done Dr. Strangelove. He didn't want to go back to that. Give him credit for that. Every single one of his films were unique, even the multiple films about war. They were very, very different. Every one of his films, quite unique. Now, space travel. You might be thinking, well, 2001 was a proponent of space travel. Okay, I can understand your argument about it not supporting evolution. But what about space travel? He was definitely being a proponent of space travel, was he not? Well, let's unpack this. How is space travel shown within this film? In the film, is space travel exciting or is it monotonous? Is space travel something that you would want to do or something that you wouldn't want to do? And really, really think about that, because there's multiple interpretations about that. And so that's something that's really shown within the film. Now, the transition to the second act of the film, we have Dr. Haywood Floyd, the director of the National Aeronautics Council, or whatever they called it in the film. And what do we see him? He's in space and he's sleeping in his seat because space travel is boring. Now, in the novel, 2001, written by Arthur C. Clarke, space travel is very exciting and it's amazing. Well, if space is exactly what we're told it is and what the scientists tell us it is and what Carl Sagans tell us it is, there's a lot of it. And so one would think it'd be very, very boring and monotonous to travel through. That's what the film shows us. What's Haywood Floyd doing every time we see him? He's eating, he's sleeping, or he's crapping. And you think I'm joking, but I'm not. And there's this very interesting scene where he gets on this new space station and stays at the Hilton Inn and calls his daughter, and we get to see a little bit of future technology, and it's kind of intriguing how there were some predictions. Now, people say that 2001 is kind of absurd because you see some old 1960s technology in the film, but they're traveling to space and they're going to the moon and they're even sending a mission out to Jupiter. Although, on the other hand, I could say, yes, and here in the real year of 2025, we have artificial intelligence at our fingertips. We have smartphones and laptops and computers and smart TVs and everything else. And we only send dummies to the moon now. I mean, make of it what you will, but yeah, that's just me being a little flippant. But the Dr. Haywood Floyd that's shown in 2001, played by actor William Sylvester, you might recognize him. He shows up in You Only Live Twice, the James Bond film. He's the American bureaucrat at the Pentagon who's very slowly giving pronunciations. He plays the role of the bureaucrat, Dr. Haywood Floyd, perfectly. You know, he comes across some Russian scientists. What's going on with Clavius Base on the moon, Dr. Floyd? They ask him. We hear there's an epidemic. And Dr. Floyd tells them nothing. He says he's not at liberty to discuss it. Of course, he goes through the pleasantries, plays it perfectly. And you see how the human society has, quote unquote, evolved, or de-evolved, if it were. Because one thing that Kubrick paid attention to was human interaction. Remember in Paths of Glory, we have how the generals manipulate the other generals to do what they want them to do. Well, here you've got Haywood Floyd. And here he is going off with a foreign interaction with some friends and some acquaintances and playing it quite perfectly. There's even the scene where he gets to the moon and yes, here he is eating, and his subordinates at Clavius Base. And he gives a very rousing speech when he gets there about how they have to maintain secrecy about what they found there on Clavius Base. And yes, spoiler, they found a monolith there on the moon from the American base. And of course, they also show some of the other details of space travel, such as the grip shoes that they had because there's no gravity unless you induce the gravity by doing rotation, such as in the space station and the centrifuge that we'll see in the USS Discovery. Anyway, a little detail I want to highlight about what's shown here in 2001 is the dialogue, because what dialogue there is in the film, it makes it very clear that they, of course, call Dr. Haywood Floyd and say, thank you for the speech. It's really going to beef up morale. And then Dr. Floyd says, you guys have done a wonderful job handling things, keeping it secret. And then, of course, they tell him, well, yes, we're going to do things your way. You're the boss. They don't quite say those exact words, but that's exactly what they say. And oddly enough, you have another understanding of the hierarchical relationships. And of course, Dr. Floyd is briefed on this monolith, or the Tycho-Magnetic Anomaly, TMA1 as they call it, that they found on the moon. They haven't located the one that existed on Earth. That gave the monkeys, hominids, apes, early men their idea to use tools. And in this very I'll say it, some people consider this a monotonous section, but there's a reason for it. Space travel is boring in the film. All there is to do is eat, talk to people when there's people to talk to, sleep, and then, of course, when you have to, use the bathroom. And the zero-gravity toilet is very, very complicated to use. There's 10 sets of instructions there, and he looks rather concerned. And there's a reason. Remember, his films, he had total creative control. Arthur C. Clarke had no control over what was actually filmed and what was put in the screenplay. This was all Stanley Kubrick. Now, you could say that he was showing the details of how difficult space travel would be. Maybe. Or maybe he was showing something else about the reality of space travel. It's ultimately your own conclusions to make. But when you look at it through that lens, how there's absolutely nothing exciting for Dr. Floyd, when he goes from Earth to the space station and then the space station to the moon, and every nuanced detail of that is shown, you realize what it's all about. I mean, there's a little more dialogue when he addresses the staff of Clavius Base, and they've come up with their cover story of the epidemic because they don't want anybody on Earth to know about the monolith they found on the moon. The people need to be prepared, and if they're not prepared, it's going to be a disaster. Those exact words. Oh, by the way, we appreciate your cooperation, and after this speech, you're going to sign oaths of secrecy. Now, we're not really sure the composition of the staff. It should be noted that everybody has the title of doctor in this film, or scientist, or whatever. So we're not under the impression that this is a military organization, but it's rather odd that it functions like a military organization. You might also notice that when Dr. Floyd is giving his little speech at Clavius Base, virtually every shot frames Old Glory right next to him. Again, no coincidence. And then, of course, he goes out on the moon and they look at the monolith, the Tycho-Magnetic Anomaly 1 that they found. And while they're posing for pictures and having a grand old time with it after talking about how awesome they all are, then they hear this high-pitching sound and a signal's being sent out from it. And then 18 months later, we have the Discovery mission. Now, I show this image of Roy Scheider because he played Heywood Floyd in 2010. And his portrayal of Heywood Floyd is completely different. He's a gregarious character. He seems to be much more of an interactive human being. Very, very different on the scale. Now, you could account for that by the fact that 2010, one, it's a different movie, a different director. It's still a very good movie, don't take me wrong. Unfortunately, it will always be compared to 2001, and it's very, very hard to compare any film with 2001. And don't even get me started on Interstellar. And by the way, I am a big Christopher Nolan fan. I loved his Dark Knight trilogy. But there is no comparing Interstellar to 2010, let alone 2001. Just my opinion. Maybe you think it's a great film. I always like this little shot here of Stanley Kubrick directing William Sylvester here, and you can see how they would frame a lot of these shots. Because remember, they had to do all of this practically. Now, 18 months later, the USS Discovery, interestingly enough, a more practical spaceship design than what we'd have with the subsequent space shuttle. And what are you talking about, Aurelian? Well, the crew compartment is located very far away from the engines. You know, instead of putting the crew compartment on top of the engines or right next to them like they did with the space shuttle. One of those interesting design flaws. Now, what's the practicality of all space designs? Don't ask me, but that's something that the official individuals would point out. Of course, the official explanation is NASA needed to reduce funds because people weren't interested in space travel once the United States reached the moon. By the way, 2001 was released in spring of 1968. The United States Apollo 11 mission didn't get to the moon until July of 1969. Just keep that in mind, a little detail there. And we see life on the USS Discovery. Now, there's only 2 astronauts that are awake. The other 3 are asleep. They've been trained separately. And what we learn is that the 2 astronauts who are commanding the Discovery, in conjunction with the artificial intelligence HAL 9000, only HAL knows about the existence of the monolith. The 2 astronauts, who are Frank Poole and David Bowman, David Bowman's the commander, they don't know anything about the monolith. Their mission is they think they're going to explore Jupiter and document the moons. And so they're kept in the dark. And David Bowman's portrayed by Keir Dalia, and Frank Poole is portrayed by Gary Lockwood. You might recognize Gary Lockwood there. He also played Gary Mitchell, Lieutenant Commander Gary Mitchell. I think I might have erroneously said that he was the original first officer of the Enterprise. That was incorrect. He was Kirk's choice to be first officer, but Spock became first officer. And I guess there's some beta level information about that. But one really impressive thing, the centrifuge, the rotating section of the USS Discovery that simulates gravity, they built that entire set to make it look real. Again, no special effects. None whatsoever. Yeah, there you go. Kept in the dark. Big surprise. And actually, that's what prompts the entire plot of the whole film. But what's interesting is to think about this concept of a centrifuge, a rotating section of the ship that simulates gravity. Well, it doesn't simulate gravity. It creates gravity, if you will. Because one of the biggest problems that we're informed with actual space travel is that you can't have astronauts, cosmonauts, whatever we're calling them today, operate in zero gravity for an extended period of time. That's why we do all those studies on the International Space Station, right? And here we're still at it in 2025. But here's a little picture of the set. And, you know, in interviews with Keir Dalia and Gary Lockwood, they talk about how they set up this entire centrifuge and what they had to do with filming this and how they would strap Gary Lockwood to the seat and then have Keir walk around to him to really simulate the centrifuge, the concept of this rotating section of the ship that would create gravity, which suddenly made this long journey, this nearly 2 to 3 year long journey from Earth to Jupiter plausible, at least for the astronauts. And here's another image of Stanley with a centrifuge. And, you know, it's really, really amazing to me. By the way, the centrifuge was not featured at all in the film 2010. They featured the pod bay and the command deck of the Discovery and the emergency airlock, but they did not show the centrifuge. Probably wasn't an easy set to construct. Very intriguing, wouldn't you say? Just a little detail there. And now we talk about artificial intelligence, the HAL 9000, the computer. of the USS Discovery. Now, of course, you can talk about all the nuances of HAL being close to IBM and so on and so forth, but then there's also the algorithm for what HAL really stands for. By the way, it includes algorithm in it. But artificial intelligence, that runs the ship, that's trusted to run the ship. And of course, HAL is voiced by Canadian actor Douglas Rain. A little side note, if you want to watch something interesting, watch the Canadian-produced film Universe from the very early 1960s, which Douglas Rain narrated. And that was where Stanley Kubrick had actually gotten the inspiration to make this space film. And when they were filming it, he didn't have the voice of HAL figured out. He actually had one of his assistant directors doing the voice. So in interviews with Keir Dullea and Gary Lockwood, they talk about how the voice of HAL 9000 sounded like Michael Caine. It was very British because his assistant director was British, because Stanley Kubrick's crew was British. He had American funding, but he was working with the British filmmaking industry. So again, infinite resources to make this incredible film that's visually striking. But HAL 9000, the computer that knows of the existence of the monolith, its main directive is to process information and share it with the crew of the Discovery. But HAL's been given an order from the National Security Council, the United States High Command, not to share the existence of the monolith. And this creates a conflict within the programming of HAL. Now, in the film, it's kept very vague for why HAL malfunctions and decides to kill the crew, because yes, spoiler, if you haven't seen it, that's what he decides to do. But in the novel, they make it clear it's the conflicting orders. And then in the sequel, 2010, they openly state it. And then there's a hilarious denial by Roy Schreider as Haywood Floyd, "I didn't know," even though in 2001, there's a video of his character saying, "Known only to your HAL 9000 computer and not to you, we have evidence of alien life, the monolith." Yeah, it's kind of hilarious when you think about it. So is he lying, or, is it just because of different continuity? Hard to say. But what's really interesting is that when HAL is questioning Dave and asking him, "What do you think about these rumors of our mission being for different reasons and these strange reports that we have of things being found on the moon?" And then, of course, the scientific crew being trained separately and all the security. And it's almost as though he's trying to get Dave to say something. But Dave doesn't say anything. He says, "You're working up your crew psych report." You can almost hear the palatable disappointment in HAL's voice that he didn't bait Dave into saying something. And right when Dave responds that way is when HAL comes up with the very phony malfunction of the AE-35, or their transmitter that talks back to Earth. Well, of course, Dave goes out there, they bring in the AE-35 transmitter, and he can't find anything wrong with it. So they go and have a private conversation in the pod. They think that HAL can't monitor them. And so they talk about disconnecting HAL because it seems like HAL's malfunctioning. And the conversation is the most dialogue really in the middle section of the film. And it's really intriguing when you think of how different both the actors and the characters are. Keir Dullea and Gary Lockwood. You couldn't really find two different guys. But the way they come across, Gary Lockwood's character, Frank Poole, is very confrontational to HAL. Dave is a lot more understanding. He tries to play it easy with HAL. But when they're locked in the pod and they think that HAL can't monitor him, although here's HAL's red eye in the background. Now, if you didn't see this film in theaters, there was an intermission that occurred. And right when they talk about disconnecting HAL, because if they determine HAL is malfunctioning, they decide to disconnect him. And basically that's killing HAL. At least that's how HAL would see it. We find out that HAL is actually reading their lips and knows exactly what they're saying. The film cuts to intermission right at that point. And so I remember everybody being out in the, going to the bathroom and talking, and they're saying, "Oh my gosh, the computer knows that they're possibly planning to disconnect it." Well, Frank goes out there to replace the unit, and HAL rams into him with the pod. And of course, it breaks his oxygen and sends him flying. And Frank is done for. He dies after about a minute. And it's one of the more famous scenes. And, the horror of the void is what people will say, because there's no sound in space. Of course, if you watch a Star Wars film, there's explosions and, people are running from one explosion to the next. And yes, that's even the original Star Wars films. But remember that George Lucas was inspired by the vision of 2001, especially the detail in the models and the large jets and even the large moon command base. So Dave rushes out to go help his fellow astronaut, not knowing what's happened. He asks HAL, "What happened?" And HAL says, "Insufficient data. Do you have a lock?" "Yes, I have a lock." However, in his rush to go assist his fellow astronaut in the pod and go EVA, Dave forgets his space helmet. And it's a very human action. Now, the two actors, Keir Dullea and Gary Lockwood, were handpicked by Stanley Kubrick. There was no audition. He knew exactly who he wanted to portray those astronauts. And they played their roles perfectly because these were two guys who were isolated in the middle of nothing for a long period of time. And they were just going through the routines. But you see Dave Bowman commit a very human mistake here. He forgets his space helmet and goes EVA. He does pick up the body of Frank Poole and tries to return to Discovery. However, when he returns to Discovery, Hal won't let him back in. There's the famous exchange. Open the pod bay doors, Hal. I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that. What's the problem? You know what the problem is. And of course, Hal tells him, I read your lips. I know you plan to disconnect me. I cannot allow that. It will end the mission. Well, Dave has no choice. He doesn't have his space helmet. And so he tells Hal, fine, I'll go in through the emergency airlock. He has to drop the body of Frank Poole, although that does come up in the Arthur C. Clarke sequels. And I'm kind of glad they've never actually made 2064 or 3001 into films, because I'd hate to see what they'd make these days. Yes, I'm being honest with all of you. But they do this incredible scene where Dave goes in the emergency airlock. Now, again, this is where we're talking about the quote-unquote feasibility of space. Now, can someone, as we understand the scientific explanation of space being a great vacuum, actually survive in vacuum? Because that's what Dave Bowman has to do when he's blowing out the pod by blasting the emergency door, the hatch, and going into the emergency airlock. It's a great stunt, too, and Keir Dullea explains it very well, how they actually film it where he was up 2 stories and jumped down with a rope attached to him, and then they had another guy, off camera, of course, with the rope, who jumped back the other direction. And that's how they got that effect of him being pulled back up towards the ceiling. Very, very incredible. But, they said that it was technically incorrect because it looks like he took a deep breath before he was blown out into the airlock, in the vacuum. And of course, Arthur C. Clarke said, they just should have consulted me. I would have told them how it was done. Because remember, from my knowledge, Arthur C. Clarke had never been in space. But of course, neither had Carl Sagan. But just because someone hasn't been somewhere doesn't mean they're not an expert in it, right? Now, don't think I'm denigrating Arthur C. Clarke. I know he did deep sea diving, and he was a very creative writer. But, was he actually in space? I mean, was Mary Beard ever in Rome? No. Was Lucius Aurelian, me, ever affiliated with anything in Rome? Hell no. But, if I'm a good writer, I can tell you that I am. Now, once Dave gets back in, he puts back on another space helmet and goes to disconnect Hal. And this is where I think there's a lot of great acting from Keir Dullea, because you see this interplay between Dave. He's initially in a vengeful mood. He wants to disconnect Hal because, while he was outside, Hal killed the 3 sleeping astronauts and has already killed Frank Poole. So that's 4 humans he's killed. And now Dave's only recourse is to disconnect Hal. And initially he's vengeful. But as he goes on with disconnecting Hal, Hal begs him to stop. And Hal even says it, I feel my mind going. And the facial acting that you get from Keir Dullea is quite incredible. Now, I have a lot of respect for Keir Dullea because it's not just the fact that he was in 2001 and played a very difficult role. There was a series in the 1970s that everybody forgot about, early 1970s. I think it came out in 1973, from the Canadian Broadcasting Company. And it was based on a plot by Harlan Ellison called The Star Lost. And Keir Dullea went all into it, even though the show was set up from the start to fail. The writer, Harlan Ellison, didn't want anything to do with it because he felt the producers were hamstringing it. And Harlan Ellison had a reputation, I don't know, I wasn't there, I don't know what happened, but for having great ideas but not finishing them. So really it was when Babylon 5 came about and J. Michael Straczynski figured out the perfect role for Harlan Ellison, creative consultant. But don't count on him to finish scripts on time. He's got a great mind, but don't count on him to finish things in time. Anyway, Keir Dullea starred in that series, and it's got a lot of intriguing ideas, but I'm not going to recommend it because it is a very, very hard watch. And there are parts of it that you can just tell they didn't really go all in on. But then after he disconnects HAL 9000, a very difficult scene, he gets the taped message from Dr. Floyd, where Dr. Floyd says, only known to your HAL 9000, alien life was found on the moon. And there's a larger monolith near Jupiter, 2 kilometers long. And this is the reaction shot. So Dave spends another couple months on the Discovery all by himself. HAL 9000 is disconnected, the other crew are dead, and he ejects the bodies into space. And he comes across the 2-kilometer long massive monolith. And yeah, I use this image because some of the film shots are difficult to see. And he actually goes through the monolith. Is it a Stargate? Is it a portal? Hard to say. And this is where the film goes through its psychedelic effect and some of the most unique psychedelic effects, again, that you're never going to see in a film. What's it really representing? Oh, it looks like I missed something. Oh, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that, as you wish. And thank you, Nana. I appreciate that very much. Yeah, I'll admit this is a little bit more of an exploration that I'm doing because I find this topic quite interesting. So now he really has no one to talk to. Yeah, exactly, Kathy. Yeah, Leo says the singularity. That's a good point. I mean, what is it? And that's another question in terms of people saying that maybe Kubrick was hinting at something, going through a portal. What really is what we think of as space travel? Is there a reality to it? Or is it all just something that we see in our minds? How practical is it? And you see so many incredible images. And of course, this is one of my favorites. You have these very, very strange diamond devices. Are these some kind of life form? Are these disembodied ethereal life forms? Are they some kind of AI? What exactly are they? That's the beauty of this film. There's so many ways to interpret this. There's a reason, though, that I'm highlighting this scene. There's something very, very critical that's communicated in this. Now, if you get the chance, go ahead and watch the Stargate scene, if you will, where Dave Bowman traverses the monolith. Now, there's a line that's not in the film where he goes in the monolith and he says, "My God, it's full of stars." That's only in the book. It's not in 2001. There's no dialogue in the entire final section of the film. It's all imagery. But immediately following this scene, you see the camera go over some desert scenery, and they filmed it in Arizona, and they do some interesting color effects. But knowing what we know about deserts and knowing what we know about some of the interesting structures there, watch it. Watch this particular scene and pay very close attention to every little detail and nuance. And you might be surprised with some of the things that stand out to you. Now, I'm not going to tell you exactly what to look for. I'm just going to tell you to look at it with the glasses that we look through when we do our explorations. What's really going on? What's it really about? Is that what's really being communicated in this film? Now, when Dave reaches the end of his journey, he's suddenly transported to what seems to be this incredible, comfortable Victorian-era hotel. But it's not perfect. A glowing floor, an odd mishmash of conflicting styles. And how many times do we see this with architecture? And by the way, Stanley Kubrick does highlight architecture in his films. And they do tell a very important part of the story. Now, is it even these advanced life forms? Are they aliens? Are they some kind of advanced AI? You know, the monoliths are stated to be AI, but who knows? You can read the Arthur C. Clarke books and he spells it out very clearly. But you can just watch the film and Stanley Kubrick says, you interpret the ending. I'm not going to tell you what to think. And Keir Dullea said the same thing. You interpret the ending. It can have multiple different interpretations. What I find interesting, you see the same thing that we see with the attempt to replicate old world buildings. A very honest attempt, but also a very vain attempt. And what happens here in this part of the film is we see Dave rapidly age, or he goes through some kind of strange time vortex where suddenly he's in his late 20s, and now all of a sudden he's a very, very old man, and then he sees the monolith. Now, little note, Keir Dullea is still with us. He's almost 90 years old, and he's as sharp as a tack, kind of like William Shatner. So I guess the secret to longevity in the 1960s was to star in a science fiction franchise. Oh, by the way, Gary Lockwood's still with us, too. I think he's 88 now. You might remember when he portrayed Gary Mitchell in Star Trek Where No Man Has Gone Before. Great character. But anyway, he encounters another monolith, and suddenly he's transformed into the Star Child. What the hell is the Star Child, you might ask? Is it Dave being transformed into a different life form? Is he ascending? Some people would say, well, it's evolution, get it? People went from monkeys, they evolved into humans, and humans evolved into Star Child. But there is no damned evolution in this film because it's the other agency, whether you want to think of it as an alien intelligence, a deity, that transforms the creatures from one form to the other. That's not flippant evolution. So what to make of it? That's the real brilliance of the film, though, is that it's open to interpretation. Sure, you can take it at face value and say, yeah, it's kind of a trippy film. It's got the big psychedelic scene in it, and I expect to see things blow up every 5 seconds, so I can't really pay attention to it, And I'll be honest with y'all, I've been conditioned to be that way. We all have. Of course, there's a reason why Star Wars was blasted in our eyes, and I'm not saying Star Wars are bad films or anything like that, even the more recent ones. I don't have to say that. But you think about how attention spans and how the way we have been formatted as human beings has changed from when this film was released in the 1960s. Yeah, attention spans were longer, but even back then, people had difficulty following the film, but they enjoyed it. There's a reason why this is remembered as such an incredible film, and why no one's ever going to remake 2001. No one's ever going to remake or reimagine a Kubrick film. Interstellar was a love letter to it. I guess you could say that, in the same way that Superman Returns was a love letter to the Richard Donner film. But, make of it what you will. The detail that Kubrick went in building out these scenes and really staging this is what's remembered most about this film. And also all the detail that he did in all these sets. Now remember, this film took a long time to make. Keir Dullea and Gary Lockwood had finished filming their scenes by 1966. The film wasn't released until 1968. Still had to do the ape monkey scene, which was done with mimes, by the way. Still had to do all the location shooting. Remember that Stanley Kubrick did not fly. He had a pilot's license, but he did not fly. I remember Keir Dullea saying many times he would send out location scouts, and then they would interface. And remember, this was before the internet. This was before email was available to everybody. Somehow he would interface and get the exact shots that he wanted to. Yet the guy wasn't known to fly. He would take a boat. Another little interesting detail. All right, let's go to our final film here that we're going to look at with Stanley Kubrick. Now, I know there are plenty of other films with Stanley Kubrick, A Clockwork Orange, but we're just covering the first phase. And if there's a demand, we'll look at the second phase. Why am I ending with A Clockwork Orange? Well, A Clockwork Orange, 1971, was the film that Stanley Kubrick kind of made in response to 2001. And here was the thing. I guess he had gotten some, how shall we say, criticism about the fact that, look, if you can make a film with infinite resources, all the budget, all the special effects, and over a 5-year period, can you make a film with a very limited budget? And then the answer is yes. And I'm going to do A Clockwork Orange. And A Clockwork Orange is really the start of Malcolm McDowell's career. And that guy's been in so many movies now, Of course, he was famous as the guy who killed Captain Kirk in a very ill-fated scene that was not very well written, in my humble opinion. Thank you, Ronald D. Moore. But, at least we've never had to endure the assassination of the Captain Kirk character. And no, none of the characters of Captain Kirk that I've seen since 2000 do I accept as Captain Kirk. There's only one Captain Kirk, and that is William Shatner. That's just my opinion. Make of it what you will. And yes, I'm well aware of all of William Shatner's character flaws. I'm not someone who thinks that he's a god. I think he's someone who's had a successful career, and he's rather quite comical, and he's managed to parlay that in many ways. He also has many character flaws, as do we all. So anyway, Clockwork Orange. Stanley Kubrick adopted another book showing how society can create terrifying things. Now, the reason I show this little still here from 1984, and this is actually from the film 1984, from the same year, 1984, the one with John Hurt, I'm showcasing the brutalist architecture that was in the film. Recall that Stanley Kubrick was big on showing architecture. And in A Clockwork Orange, you can't help but notice all the brutalist architecture. Now, if you're not familiar with the plot of the film, a wild time in society is broken down. You have a society that is very, very permissive. People can do whatever the heck they want to, and it's created a lot of violent activities. You have disengaged families, and you have people running around just committing acts of ultraviolence. Yes, I'm summarizing this very, very distinctly. But this is shown. This brutalist architecture is part of this dystopia. It's a key factor in the film. And these groups of young men that operate, in what we might think of, today we'd call them gangs, but, his droogs, the different names that we have for them, engaging in ultraviolence. And they all have their special outfits they wear, their little signs, and their power struggles. And that's really what the film is about. These out of control, violent maniacs that were created by the society. And Oh, by the way, notice the floor here. Yeah, no coincidence again. These crazy acts of violence and this strange symbolism and the fact that they're induced by drugs and just seeking a thrill. And that's really the whole first half of the film until eventually he gets caught because things go against him and he is reformed using the Ludovico technique. He is reformed using conditioning. He's a big fan of Beethoven music. And unfortunately, while he's receiving negative conditioning not to commit acts of violence or assault against other people again, and believe me, this guy does it all. Terrifying violence, sexual assault, nothing inhibited. He is completely uninhibited. And as the film and the original story makes it clear, it's the society that's produced and contributed to this. Now, I'm not saying this is our society. I am merely highlighting what the film is saying. Okay, let's be clear on that. But the film is saying that this society, this free fall society, is allowing this to happen. And worst of all, instead of allowing people to be individuals, it's actually encouraging this because instead of allowing people to seek purpose, they have to seek their own purpose through violence. That's what the film is saying. Now, of course, he's caught and he's thrown in jail and he talks about reform, but is he really reforming or is he just acting like he's reforming? And then, of course, what happens with the society. Now, there's a very subtle change in the civilization in the film. Blink and you'll miss it. But we have one government that changes and goes to a different form of government. So it goes from being a very permissive, open government as we understand it. Again, this is just the film. And it goes to being a more controlled government. And that's why we have things like the Ludovico technique. By the way, pay attention to some of the artwork that's featured in this film. And once again, the devil's in the details. Remember, everything that ended up on screen, Stanley Kubrick knew about and approved. And through the acts of violence, and then through the conditioning, and even the prison. Oh, by the way, there are some incredible old world buildings that you do see in this film, but they're far and few between. And guess what's one of them? And it's no coincidence once again. Oh, by the way, I'm trying to remember the name of the actor. It'll come to me in a second. It's escaping me. But it's a connection with Patton. It was the guy who played Montgomery. He actually plays the prison captain. So, oh yeah, and there's a lot of inspiration for 13 Monkeys that came from it, and virtually every other. Oh, what's this here? The ultimate stare scene was epic. Oh yeah, and it's actually it's a film trope, the Kubrick stare. So just something else that's quite intriguing about it. But that's really the nature of the film. Oh yeah, the prison. And so, of course, he goes through the classical conditioning. They play Beethoven, so he can't listen to Beethoven without being sick. And suddenly he's helpless. There's still violent people in society, but now he can't defend himself. And, of course, the individual who he wronged and attacked and killed his wife, he wants to get his revenge on him. But then the government says, look, you are going to tell us that we helped you and we'll make good. And then he says, in the end, I was cured, as he's having a fantasy about engaging in violence once again. And so what you realize in the entire film, it doesn't matter. The controlling forces will create a monster, and it will sustain a monster, and it will justify sustaining a monster. And ultimately, it doesn't matter what type of government you have, whether it's a permissive or a controlling government. Again, that's what the film is saying. I'm not saying that. That's what the film is very clearly saying. And of course, Malcolm McDowell, this was really the start of his entire film career. And my goodness, the guy's been in how many films now? I mean, he's always been busy. And, also remember when he was in the Wing Commander series as Admiral Toll and played the role very well. For some reason, wasn't in the film. Don't know why. Another one of those strange things. Oh, yeah, here he is, the guy who portrayed Field Marshal Montgomery in Patton. Played the role very well. And like I said, go back and actually listen to how Patton sounds and compare it to George C. Scott. It's quite interesting. And then some of the brutalist architecture that appears in the film, representing this incredible society, this civilization that's in this film. The way the music comes together and the way that this film just feels like it's out of complete left field. It is very creative. And it's very different than the previous films that Stanley Kubrick did. Now, I know there are other films that he did, and I'm going to wait to see if there's actually a demand from viewers to continue covering those films. Now, I know you're probably asking, when are you going to cover Eyes Wide Shut? That's the film we really want you to get to because there's all kinds of, how shall we say, disclosures in that film. Yes, there are. And I have talked about Eyes Wide Shut before. It was actually when I did the exploration with Donnie P, NMM Podcastio. That was last fall. Very interesting exploration where we talked about Milton Keynes and how one of the statues in the theater district looked exactly like the statues from Eyes Wide Shut, the last film of Stanley Kubrick, where they just all happen to be wearing carnival masks from, that great carnival in Venice. Now, other films of Stanley Kubrick. You have one of the most overlooked, tragically overlooked films. Yeah, there is Lolita. The interesting thing about Lolita is that's a very difficult one to cover for a variety of reasons. But that's one of them. But the one that gets overlooked is Barry Lyndon. That was supposed to be Stanley Kubrick's Napoleon film. But the issue is they had that Napoleon film that fell on its face, and so he changed it to make it more of an epic film. Here's what's interesting about Barry Lyndon. He actually filmed the entire film using natural lighting. And it's probably one of the most beautiful films you've ever seen. And it looks completely natural. There's also some incredible old world architecture that's showcased in Barry Lyndon. And it gets even more comical when you watch the film and you think about, gee, we've got this entire civilization that's on horse and buggy and somebody managed to build all these incredible structures. Yeah. So there's Barry Lyndon. There's The Shining. The Shining, you could do a whole live stream exploration on in and of itself. There's so much subtext in that and so much meaning. And then, of course, there's Full Metal Jacket, the final great war film that he did. And then Eyes Wide Shut. There's plenty of other films that we haven't talked about yet with Stanley Kubrick, but I wanted to talk about this first phase because you look at how it corresponds with what was going on with the things that we've explored. How we went to the post-war period and went through urban renewal. And all these films seem to be communicating that. It seemed to be warning of what could happen. I mean, A Clockwork Orange is a warning. Dr. Strangelove is some kind of disclosure. If he was really concerned about nuclear war, then he would have made a serious film just like Failsafe. He did not make a serious film. He made a satire, a black comedy. Ah, yes. And Eyes Wide Shut sucked. It is interesting that there was a big break from Eyes Wide Shut in his last film. Some people say that it was all disclosure and he wasn't actually trying to get a good film out. I don't know. But yeah. Yeah, Minority Report. Yeah, that is an interesting film. Of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention AI and who was originally supposed to do AI and who ended up doing AI. So. Well, and then there were some interesting rumors that came about with Eyes Wide Shut. Really going through that film, not appreciating the film for its merits itself, but what the film was actually showing us. And perhaps the most interesting detail about it, the book that film was originally based on. Yes, the film is in New York City, but the original book was set in Vienna, in Austria, a place that has gotten our attention before. So, who would approve brutalist designs? Somebody who's trying to keep everyone in a very lax state of mind. Or, maybe you could say it's classical conditioning. I don't know. And so there we have it. But if there is a demand, I will cover the other films of Stanley Kubrick. And I do plan to devote some time, if we go to another old world in film, just to The Shining, because there's a lot of interesting details with The Shining. Yes, Jack Nicholson, so on and so forth, but there's a lot more of it behind that. Megalopolis. Yeah, don't get me started on that one. That's Francis Ford Coppola. So anyway, well, when we get to it, we'll come back to it. Now, I have one final thing I wanted to talk about. And going back to 2001. 2001, A Space Odyssey showcased us AI, artificial intelligence, the first mainstream pop culture display of artificial intelligence. What's artificial intelligence gotten us? Well, I thought I would do a little test before I got to this exploration and just play with that old trope AI is a crapshoot. Now, you may recall when I did the exploration on the strange events that occurred after World War II, one of the questions that's always bothered me, and this is from something that even when I taught history, I wanted to ask the almighty AI, because people in the comment section will say, why don't you just do a Google search? Well, now Google's got AI. And what did the AI tell us? I asked the question, why didn't the United States use nuclear weapons in the Berlin blockade? You remember the Berlin blockade. That was when the Soviet Union cut off access to Berlin from the Western powers, 1948 to 1949. And here's what the AI says. The United States did not use nuclear weapons during the Berlin blockade, primarily because doing so, this is in bold, would have risked escalating the conflict into a wider, potentially nuclear war with the Soviet Union. Now, what is the problem with this? Does anybody know what the problem with that is? I'm sorry, Aurelian, I can't do that. This is supposed to be artificial intelligence. What's it saying? Now, it does admit its mistake here, and it's not bolded. While the U.S. had a nuclear monopoly at the time, they lacked sufficient weapons and delivery systems to ensure a decisive victory. And the potential for devastating retaliation from the Soviet Union was a major deterrent. Oh, so we're trying to have it both ways. The U.S. did not have a vast stockpile of nuclear weapons in 1948, 1949. Okay, so that's what they say. But what's the problem with this? They try to say that, well, there would be a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. But remember, when the Berlin blockade ended, it was the start of the summer of 1949. The first Soviet nuclear weapon, the first atom bomb, according to official history, was detonated 3 months after the Berlin blockade in August. So this answer is giving you a conflicting answer. Kind of like HAL 9000, right? Of course, I know this is no AI like HAL 9000. It's just an answer. And again, it's giving you a conflicting answer. So why in the hell would I ask AI anything? Why would I ever empower this Feldercard thing to think for me? I don't know. I mean, if you want to, I'm not going to think anything less of you, but I'm just saying, why would I do that? I mean, it sounds to me like it's a major inconsistency. It's one of those major inconsistencies that never made any kind of sense. Oh, we acknowledge the U.S. had a nuclear monopoly, but somehow the Soviet Union would be able to respond with a nuclear weapon that they hadn't even developed yet. Because that makes sense, doesn't it? Give me a break. You're trying to have it both ways, and you're trying to explain something that does not make sense historically. Now, maybe it would have made more sense if that B-29 that crashed in the Soviet Union towards the end of World War II had a nuclear weapon in it. Or, I don't know, maybe if it was part of the Lend-Lease program that the United States just decided to say, you know what? I think the Soviet Union should have nuclear weapons too. We're just going to give them to you, right? Because that makes sense. Yeah. Anyways, so if anybody's ever expecting me to see and consult with AI, don't count it on this channel. Hey, look, if you want to do it, all the more power to you. I am never going to do it because this is the kind of stuff that you get in answers that I don't ever want to confuse anybody with. I think it's completely absurd. It's like I'm arguing with Hal to be let back into the pod bay. As long as they print the cake and eat it too. Good one, Atom Bomb. Good one. Yeah, there you go. Maybe AI is doing parody like Kubrick. Well, remember, this is supposed to be an official historical answer. Now, let's just really think about this. The vast majority of the population, well, they would just read it and say, oh, yeah, that makes sense. They wouldn't want to escalate it into a nuclear conflict. Yeah, well, that's what they say. The spies eventually did, but, well, they exist in the minds of people, Kathy, and that's where it's most important that they exist, right? I mean, something happened to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That's what people are going to say. And I'm not denying that people died there. There was firebombing there. There was also firebombing in Germany. Nobody denies that. But what exactly happened? Wasn't there? Don't know. It is very, very interesting, though, isn't it? But it's not something you're supposed to talk about. The whole point I'm getting at is this is just very interesting. You get this bizarre, conflicting answer. You can't even give me a straight answer. This should be very direct. This should be a very easy answer. There's a better answer to this. I'll tell you what it is. As a human being, I can figure it out. Because the United States did not want to be seen as an aggressor, even though the Soviet Union had been the aggressor in cutting off access to Berlin. By the way, why didn't they cut off the air avenues of approach to Berlin? Well, because I guess that would have been too aggressive. We're only going to cut off the ground routes, because that makes sense too, right? And don't bother asking that question either. Yeah, there you go. It's a jelly donut. Absolutely right. But that's why they say, and you can find the film trope AI is a crapshoot. Hal's a crapshoot, and whatever we're calling AI today is, well, I'm not even going to call it a crapshoot. But that's okay. So conflicting answers from humans, conflicting answers from AI, it's all the same thing. Maybe you're just better off thinking for yourself. I don't know, call me crazy. Anyway, a little bit of an off-key exploration. I hope you enjoyed it. Please hit the like button and appreciate you supporting the channel. Oh, what's Adam got here? Always possible the same AI wrote history that we read about the old world. Yeah, well, you know what? If the same one wrote it, Brother Adam, you'd think we'd get some more consistency in the answers. This would be a little bit better thought out, don't you? But, you know, you got that inconvenient thing with certain people asking questions that, you know, they're not supposed to ask, but people are still asking those questions. So I don't know what to make of it. Maybe it does all make sense. If you turn your brain off, it makes perfect sense. If you let someone or something else think for you, it does make sense. So anyway, well, I hope you enjoyed this exploration. Hit the like button before you go. And this is Lucius Aurelian signing off. We'll see you on the next exploration.